Yo, it is actually insane how headlines can set narratives. Back on January 8th, so it's not even that long ago, Chris Dring from thegamebusiness.com shared an article indicating that the Nintendo Switch 2 was down 35% compared to what the Switch 1 delivered during the same period in 2017. This is specifically talking about the November and December numbers. The holiday season. People said that he was a liar, they called him a grifter, they said that he was just trying to build off of the Nintendo hype, and he had an insider that provided the source, a senior employee from Nintendo, and Chris Dring's been in the industry forever, so he knows these things, he knows people. But everybody just dragged him through the mud because they're like, he's just full of crap, he's making things up. They said he was trying to paint the US holidays as worse than they actually were. Meanwhile, this morning, Matt Piscatella of Circana decides to share data for Nintendo sales in December. He highlights that the Nintendo Switch 2 officially in the USA has sold 4.4 million units. Prior to the holiday season, the Nintendo Switch 2 sat just around 3 million. The data on that 3 million is not exact, but it's a fair estimate based off of the data that he himself has provided month over month. So this means that the Nintendo Switch 2, in its very first holiday season, managed to sell 1.4 million. We had estimates for November's numbers. It was down 35% in November. And now we have estimates for December's numbers, and it's also down roughly 35% in December. I think in total, the calculation is around 38.5% down based off of the numbers compared to 2017. So the data that Chris Dring had shared on January 8th was absolutely correct. If anything, he was being nice to the US sales numbers by about 2 or 3%. But Matt Piscatella is coming in today, and he's completely neglecting the comparison to 2017 from the Switch 1 versus the Switch 2, which is what most people were doing over every single month, including Matt Piscatella in some of his previous press releases. The bottom line, though, is that this was not a good December for Nintendo. Not anywhere in the world except for maybe Japan, and even then it was less than what the Switch 1 did in 2017 in Japan. And let me be very clear. Everything that I am talking about is strictly Circana numbers. These are official numbers provided to us by Circana, whether it was numbers from back in a decade ago, 15 years ago, or even 4 and 5 years ago. So no matter how pretty the headlines are painted today, the fact of the matter is the Nintendo Switch 2 had an abysmal holiday season, being just as bad in December as it was in November when you compare each month to their respective month in 2017. Both of them are roughly 35 to 40%. Now, what makes this even more interesting is that the Nintendo Switch 2 needed discounts all through December to reach this low bar. So we're already seeing the effects of these discounts. With simply just putting $50 off, they were able to reach close to 1 million sales. There are some people that estimate that it did actually reach 1 million, but again, this is all based off of vague data from tracking. It's not accurate. It could be 1 million, it could be 900,000, it could be 1.1 million. Whatever you put into December takes away from November, so it just kind of depends on how you balance those two out. But the only concrete number given to us by Matt Piscatella was that the Switch 2 has reached 4 million by the end of its year. And so naturally, the focus now, because it's the only thing that's left to hold onto for the Switch 2, is how it's the fastest selling console amongst the first 4 months of its life. Now, first off, that's already fake because that doesn't include the handheld consoles. The Game Boy Advance is still ahead of the Switch 2, so it's not even the fastest selling game console. And everybody has made it very clear to me that the Switch 2 is a handheld console, but now all of a sudden they're gonna be like, well, it's more like a home console. We don't count the Game Boy Advance. Sure. But even if you remove that from the equation, almost every other popular game console had a stronger first December than the Nintendo Switch 2 did. This is including consoles that were not released in November. The Game Boy Advance, which also saw a June release date in the United States, just like the Switch 2 did in its first December, sold 1.7 million. The 3DS released back in March. In its first December, sold 1.6 million. The Nintendo Switch sold back in March. In its first December, sold 1.5 million. Even the PSP, 1.12 million. All of those consoles did not launch in the holiday season, but then when they got to December, they outsold the Switch 2 in the holidays. And then if you add the consoles that were actually released in November, and then you take them down to their first full December, which wouldn't be the first holiday season where they were basically supply constrained because of stock, it would be the second holiday season. So 14 months after the console launched, the PS2, 1.95 million. The Wii, 1.35 million, Xbox One, 1.28 million, Xbox 360, 1.13 million, Xbox Series consoles, 1.08 million, Nintendo DS, 1.07 million, PlayStation 4, 1.065 million, Xbox, 1.033 million, and the PlayStation 5, 850,000. But of all of the consoles on this list, the PlayStation 5 was the only one that was still supply constrained when you were looking at these numbers. There is no doubt that this is a terrible December for Nintendo Switch 2. And the best part is if you look over on the last column, almost every single one of these consoles by the end of their December, they're all fairly similar. And walking out of that December, it's not that much different. This is meant to highlight that going into that first December that these consoles had, they were fairly close. They were comparable to the Switch 2. So removing all of the stockpiling, removing the amount of months that something is out on the console, going into that December, the numbers are fairly even, and still it sold fewer units than every other console on this list in its first full December when it had supply constraints. And once again, the only console that the Switch 2 actually surpassed in its first December was the PlayStation 5, which was still supply constrained at the time of this table being made. This is a failed December. If you want to be optimistic, you can say it was better than the Wii U's. But I don't know how to tell you this, but if you have to look back to your Wii U sales numbers to determine how well your console did in December, that's not a good sign. Again, all of my data is taken from Circana, the very same data that was shared today. Launches aligned in the first 7 months. The Nintendo Switch 2 is the fastest selling console in the United States. This is true. It also had one of the worst Decembers of any console and had a significantly worse December than what the Switch had in 2017. That is also true. The difference between the Switch 2 and all of these other consoles, however, is they all built up momentum as they moved along. Not all of them started off breaking records, but as the time went on, they broke records. So for example, in the original Switch's first holiday season, it shows up November and December, and it sells 2.275 million units over those 2 months. That was a clear indication of the upwards trajectory that the Switch 1 was on. The difference is with the Nintendo Switch 2, it's been going downwards since July. And it's still true to this day. Nothing has changed. Nothing at all. There is nothing that was shared in today's data that was not already known a week and a half ago. But the lappies are all gonna eat it up and clap about it. Does this mean that the Switch 2 is still the fastest selling console in the States when launches aligned? Yes, absolutely. But the Switch 1 in 2017 was sitting at below 1.6 million units sold. The Switch 2 in June of 2025 is sitting at 1.6 million units. They were tied at the end of June, both consoles. The Switch 1 in 2017 and the Switch 2 in 2025. By the end of their first year, the Nintendo Switch, 4.876 million, and the Switch 2, 4.4 million. That is 10% behind what the Switch managed in its first year, or first calendar year, rather. So here is what I'll tell you, what the Switch 2 did that was very impressive. In its first month, it completely obliterated what the Switch 1 did in its first 3 months, right? Because in its launch month, 1.6 million. In the Switch 1's first 3 months, just under 1.6 million. All of the Switch 2's records are in that first window right there. Nothing else. There's nothing impressive that the Switch 2 has done since then. But at a level playing field, at the end of June in their respective years, July, August, September, October, November, and December. In that 6-month window, the Switch 1 has outsold the Switch 2. It went from a deficit to now being 10% ahead. Does this mean that the Switch 2 has officially failed? No. Does this mean that its holiday was a failure? Absolutely. You can't be this low on the list with the only console behind you being the PlayStation 5, which was supply constrained, and tell me that this was a successful first December for the Switch 2. You just can't. And I'm going to reiterate something that I have said a crap ton of times already on my channel. As soon as the Switch 2 has an interesting data point that does not include that first launch 4 days, I will gladly stop making these videos. But it has not just gotten bad, it's actually gotten worse every single month. November and December, both of those are 35% lower than the respective Novembers and December of the Switch 1. 35 to 40%, whatever the exact number is kind of hard to know. But December is actually worse than November because December needed the discounts on its first year. These were retailer discounts, not discounts from Nintendo. They weren't planned holiday deals from Nintendo, and that's like their new marketing strategy. No, Nintendo went into this with the expectation that their console would remain at the same price, and Nintendo has yet to drop the price. Retailers are because the console was not moving. And because of those discounts, the Switch 2 was able to tie November. 35% down compared to the Nintendo Switch 1 in November, 35% compared to the Switch 1 in December. But again, dating back, the June for the Switch 2 is better than the March, April, May, and June for the Switch 1. July for the Switch 2 is better than the July for the Switch 1. Likewise with August, September, and October. But in each one of those months, I kept insisting that the fact that the Nintendo Switch 2 was not supply constrained, and the fact that, Pokemon was being launched, as well as this is a brand new console with all of the hype and all of the expectations, the fact that it was only slightly outperforming the Switch 1's first few months on a month-to-month basis on that calendar year aligned was an immense indication that these holidays would be terrible. And these are terrible holidays. Don't let people fool you into thinking otherwise. And there have been no discounts on anything Switch 2 related through all of January. So it should be expected that even in January, it's going to be doing fewer units than what the Switch did in January of 2018, and so on and so forth. The reality is, every single month when data has been released, when Matt Piscatella shares his tweets on Blue Sky stating how well the Switch 2 is doing, in almost every single month he's had to find a way to make it seem like it's doing amazing. He does this because Nintendo is his client. He has to keep them happy to an extent. Otherwise, they'll probably stop sharing the My Nintendo Store numbers with him. And I'm not faulting him for what he's doing, nor am I saying what he's doing is wrong. He's doing exactly what he should be doing. He's bringing in a positive spin into the industry so people can be happy and Nintendo can be happy and their buyers can be happy. But he knows the data, and he's very smart about what he does. So I don't fault him for trying to spin this in a much more positive light, because everything he shared is factually true. Just like everything that I'm saying right now is factually true based off of his own data. The Nintendo Switch 2 had a 35 to 40% holiday drop-off compared to the Switch 1, and it's been slowing down dramatically ever since the first month. This is all very true. Matt Piscatella shares his information in a certain way, and I take Matt Piscatella's information and I share it to you guys in the way that you want to know. But all of us are analyzing the same thing. There is one thing, however, that Matt Piscatella did get wrong, and I'm going to call him out on this. I don't know if he watches my videos or not, but if this ends up going to him, I'd like to hear him comment about it. Also, in the odd chance that Matt actually listens to this, he's one of the few people that I would actually welcome onto my channel. I would love to have him here, and I would just shut my mouth and let him talk the entire time. I don't gotta say anything. Maybe I should shoot him an email and see where that gets me. But anyway, there is one thing that he has gotten wrong, is that his initial prediction in the beginning of this year, he assumed that the Switch 2 would sell 4.3 million. Now, he was actually right about that, mind you. 4.4 million was the ending result. That is accuracy beyond belief, and that is why he gets paid the big bucks. Mind you, he said 4.3 million initially, and every single Switch 2 fanboy, the Switch 2 White Knights, all of the guys that have been on this channel arguing with me for the past 6 months and coming in here and causing problems with everybody, every single one of them assumed that Matt would end up increasing his forecast. They think that Matt was being conservative in his estimate initially. Through July, through August, they kept coming into my comments and they're like, Matt's going to increase his forecast, his estimates. He's going to expect more than 4.3 million. And that's why I kept reiterating that Matt was talking about the Switch holiday numbers being pulled forward. And that's exactly what we saw happen here. I think the guy's a lot smarter than the Nintendo fans that were coming in here expecting it to go to 5 million this year. Especially after June and July, they were all like, oh, for sure this thing's gonna reach 5 million because the Switch 1 did over 2 million in its holiday season. There's no way that the Switch 2 is not gonna do like 2.5 to 3 million. But backing up a bit, the one thing that Matt Piscatella was actually wrong about, he said that Nintendo would reach 4.3 million units because that's the amount of consoles that Nintendo would ship out. His argument was that Nintendo would sell whatever it could ship in that first year. So he didn't base it off of demand, he based it off of supply. And he was wrong about that, because all of us know that the Nintendo Switch 2 is still very much in stock everywhere. Now, in fairness, I do wonder if we were to ask him how much do you think the Switch 2 would sell if it had unlimited stock, I don't think he would have been like, oh, it's gonna sell, 10 or 15 million in its first year. But I can guarantee you the guy would have not estimated 4.3 million if he knew that Nintendo was going to be shipping out more than 4.3 million to the US. His whole assessment from the very beginning was that Nintendo would sell whatever was able to ship. And then, as time went on and more data was released, he kept insisting that he thinks a lot of the holiday demand was pulled forward. But credit to him, he was absolutely spot on the money. Just like every other analyst and just like every other person that has some kind of connection to corporations where they gotta make press releases and release news, there are things you can criticize Matt Piscatella on. But goddamn, is this guy good at his job. Even if, he thought that the Switch 2 would be sold out by this time. But so did everybody else, so there you go. Now, the other exciting part about all of this is that now that we have the official number for what was actually sold through to the customer in the US, we can make a pretty decent prediction about how it looks worldwide. If you combine the Famitsu numbers, which is the Japanese sales from the end of 2025, along with this 4.4 million that Matt Piscatella has shared with us today, that's roughly 8.2 million consoles sold through to the US and Japan. In general, the US and Japan tend to make up roughly the 60 to 65% of the total actual sold through sales for Nintendo consoles. You're looking at roughly 13 million sold through consoles by the end of December, which would make sense because by the end of September, when there was 10.36 million consoles shipped, my estimates was that there were only 7 or 8 million that were actually sold through to customers. So potentially, on a worldwide scale, they sold 5 or 6 million consoles through to customers. These are not shipped now, we're talking about sold through. And they're strictly just estimates on my end, but they sold roughly 5 or 6 million in every month from October, November, and December. So this includes the Pokemon month of October, as well as the holidays of November and December. Now, back in 2017 with the Switch 1, in that same quarter, that October, November, December, they shipped out 7.23 million units to the whole world. That was like when the Switch went crazy. It doubled in its numbers. It was 7 million before the holidays and then over 14 million after the holidays, almost at 15 million. I'd wager that Nintendo planned to ship out roughly the same amount. The difference is, back in 2017, when Nintendo shipped out 14.86 million units to all of its customers worldwide through that entire calendar year, almost the entirety of those numbers were completely sold through to customers. And if they weren't sold by the end of the holiday season, they were sold early on in the following year, because that holiday season was when people were sprinting to the stores to buy a Switch. What we are now going to see on February 4th when Nintendo releases its next quarterlies is probably 16 or 17 million consoles shipped out to the whole world for the holiday season. And then people are going to flood this channel and they're going to come here and say that the Switch 2 just reached 17 million. It's outdoing the Switch 1. Dance hooray because they shipped out all these units, but they're going to be sell-in numbers. And I'll break those numbers down once we do get them. But this time around, we know how much was sold in Japan, where they shipped out a ton. We know how much they sold in the US, where they shipped out a ton. And the discrepancy between what was shipped and what was sold is going to be so obvious. And it's going to allow us to analyze the difference between what Nintendo expected to sell in the holiday season versus what they actually sold in the holiday season. And depending on how big that gap is between what the quarterlies say and what Circana and Famitsu say, that's going to determine the following quarter. This is why I've been saying that the Switch's drop-off will not show on this upcoming quarterly. It will show when we get the ones that go to the end of March 31st. Because there is zero chance that retailers did not over-order for the holidays in anticipation of crazy Switch 2 sales. And I'll tell you, in the US specifically, there's no way they only ordered enough to cover that 35% gap from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. The Nintendo Switch 1 did 2.25 million in November and December. I would expect that every single retailer prior to November ordered like 3 million units, expecting all of them to move off of the shelves through the holiday season. This is in the US alone. And if that ends up being right, that means they got through barely half of that. And that 3 million number is not that high. The Switch 1 was regularly doing more than 3 million in its holiday season, or at least close to 3 million in its holiday season, outside of 2017. And most of these retailers are not looking back to 2017 the way you and I are, because we want to compare the launches with the Switch 1 and the Switch 2. Most of these retailers are looking at what Nintendo was able to accomplish from 2018 and onwards, and then what the Xbox Series X and the PS5 were able to accomplish beyond 2020. They knew if they bring in 3 million, they're going to sell roughly 3 million. And mind you, the crazy part about all of these numbers about December and the fact that it's still 35% lower than what the Switch 1 did in 2017, this is with all of the discussions about the Switch 2 price hikes and related to tariffs and RAM prices increasing. So how many additional sales were made because people got scared into buying a Switch 2 now because of fear of a price hike later? And I already mentioned it before, but this is with the discounts. There were a ton of people that ran to the stores and bought a Switch 2 because it dropped down 12.5% from the retailers putting down the price throughout December. It's funny because I remember a lot of people online bringing an argument to me that the only reason the PlayStation 5 was able to sell as well as it did in November is because of discounts and nobody actually wants a PlayStation 5. And now look what happened in December for Nintendo. A discount finally caused people to rush towards the store to buy a Nintendo console. You guys are all sick of the negative discourse around Nintendo? That's what has to happen in order for people to buy in and stop being negative. You want happy-go-lucky YouTube videos where people are out here talking about fake directs that are not happening, analyzing trailers in extensive detail that does not need to be analyzed? You're mad that when you search Nintendo online, my ugly face shows up? My clickbaity grifter thumbnails show up? The people spoke. You dropped the price $50. It increased the numbers a little bit. If you want good Nintendo content where people are actually watching because they're interested in what's going on with the Nintendo world, it's on Nintendo, not on us. They dropped the price. most of us will buy in. It's not rocket science. We saw in November what happened with the PS5, and we saw in December what happened with the Switch 2. Discounts, price drops, cut back on your greed, and all of a sudden, most of the blind fanboys are back. The reality is, most of us, I can't speak for everybody, but most of us still love Nintendo games. That's all we play. And we would love nothing more than to be part of the whole Nintendo circle enjoying the games together. But it is on Nintendo to make that a reality. It's not on us. Some of us have principles, some of us have backbones, and some of us do not fold to corporations and greed especially. If you want your happy butterflies and rainbows YouTube space back, then join the cause, man. Get Nintendo to drop the price and everybody will flood right back into it. Nobody will be clicking on my videos anymore if everybody's a Nintendo fan. And then maybe people will stop complaining that my grifting ruined Nintendo's YouTubing space. Because right now there's only two types of Nintendo videos. There's the anti-Nintendo videos and then the anti-Nintendo videos. And anybody that's trying to make regular Nintendo content is obviously not getting the clicks because there are not enough Nintendo fans in our community, in our gaming circles, that are interested in the Switch 2 or any of its content. And it is all on Nintendo because of their greed and draconian practices. 35% drop off in the holidays. February 4th, Nintendo lappies are going to dance around and pretend that the Switch 2 is the most successful thing in the world. And that's going to be their last celebration about the console. Especially because Nintendo just announced that they're releasing Mario Wonder with the Mario movie. It's coming out in March. So anybody that expected that a 3D Mario was going to be announced with the new Mario movie, there you go. You're getting a Mario Wonder Switch 2 edition. Congrats. This is going to be a very slow quarter for Nintendo, and you can bet that I am going to be there covering it every step of the way. I did it before, I'll do it again. I was right about the holidays, I'll be right about more in the future. And as long as you guys remain on this journey with me, enjoying my analyses and enjoying my discussions about Nintendo, then I have no reason to stop, no matter how much they want me to. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for being such an awesome audience. I will catch you on the next one.